Doesn't sound like much of a gift, does it? Having everything that we rely on to give us strength and courage stripped away doesn't sound like much of a gift. Today we are continuing our Lent series, Gifts of the Darkwood. It's based on a book by the same name by Eric Elnes. And our gift today is the gift of emptiness. The gift of having all of those things that fill our lives that we rely on, that we have come to take for granted, taken away, stripped away, until we are truly empty before God. It's not something most of us would really run toward. It's not something most of us would really relish and call a gift. And yet God can use these moments in our lives to bless us and guide us in ways that we might not be open to at any other time. This week, this is what we're exploring in our worship and in our sermon. May God bless us and give us courage as we explore this gift. One of the most poignant stories in the Gospels is the story of Jesus' death. Death is hard enough, but on the cross, Jesus expresses a complete sense of abandonment that challenges our very understanding of a loving God who's present with us in our darkest times. Things are not always as they seem, though. Yet Jesus' cry from the cross echoes in the vast emptiness that can at times overwhelm us. Listen to this word of God from Mark 15, and we will talk in a minute about what this good news points us to.
It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two bandits, one on the right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha! You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, but cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." And someone ran, filled a sponge with the sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom.
Each of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, contain a section that talks about Christ returning and the end of days as we know it. Typically, Jesus talks about people being caught by surprise and unprepared when that day comes. In Luke's telling, in the middle of this speech, Jesus slips in something that speaks directly to our very human need to, as he says, secure our lives. We'll talk more about what that means to us in a minute.
On that day, anyone on the housetop who has belongings in the house must not come down to take them away. And likewise, anyone in the field must not turn back. Remember Lot's wife. Those who try to make their life secure will lose it, but those who lose their life will keep it.
With a sermon title like The Gift of Emptiness, it begs one to consider the losses of this past year. This has been a year unlike any other in our experience, for most of us. In dealing with a worldwide pandemic, we have lost the experience of simply being able to gather together physically as a community of faith. Zoom and Facebook are good, wonderful, glad we have it, but it's not the same as sitting down together in the same room. We have lost important relationships. Some have grown distant simply because of the lack of closeness. Some losses have been more heart-wrenching, as elderly parents living in communities have literally not been able to be in the same room with their children for almost a year. Some losses have been permanent, as people important to us have died during this pandemic, and we haven't been able to gather together again as a community of faith to support each other and to grieve and to celebrate. Those who have lost jobs during the economic effects of the pandemic know a different kind of loss, one that touches on a sense of worth and self. So it may be hard to think of emptiness as a gift when the losses are so fresh and many of them so large. Most of us don't really do well with emptiness, we have to admit it. Rather, we spend all of our days trying to fill empty spaces. Some people fill them with drugs and alcohol, some with sex. Some fill them with responsible jobs and providing for their families or making a name for themselves in the world. Some fill them with family. You see, it's not always bad things that we fill emptiness with. But what happens when the drugs stop working? Or when the ones we're chasing stop playing the game? What happens when a relationship falls apart, or a parent dies, or we lose that job or that position? What happens when a pandemic overwhelms the world and all the foundations we've relied on to help us stay strong and secure? What happens when they're all shaken or gone? Jesus said those who try to make their life secure will lose it, but those who lose their life will keep it. It's actually a proverb. It stands on its own, although Jesus uses it in the context of the judgment day. But it's a powerful proverb for us today because I think a lot of us have spent a lot of time this past year grasping at things we can't imagine living without, trying to secure our lives when things are spinning out of control. And for a lot of people, that hasn't worked out very well. Now, certainly not as well as they would have hoped. And we know that because depression and suicide rates are about 3 times higher now than they were pre-pandemic. So what does happen when the things in the relationships we've relied on to help us stay strong are shaken? And what happens when those things that give us a sense of worth and significance and meaning have just been stripped away? One of the most poignant moments in Scripture is when Jesus cries out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It's a very unnerving cry. And for many people, that cry has become a crisis of faith, because how can Jesus, God in the flesh, be abandoned by God? Logic just breaks down at that point. But it also reminds us that what we feel may not necessarily reflect reality. There was a very human piece to that cry from the cross, from the one who was both human and divine. The cry is not the whole story. Eric Elnes, in his book Gifts of the Dark Wood, talks about black hole faith. Black holes are a really unique phenomenon in the universe where Gravity is so strong that not even light can escape. Now, no one knows what's exactly in the center of a black hole. There's all sorts of theories, including that they may be gateways to other universes. But what we do know is that in its mysterious center is a region of such infinite density, the singularity it's called, that all known laws of physics break down. I don't remember where I read this, but one physicist said that where all the laws of physics break down, a world of endless possibilities is born. Where all the laws of physics break down, a world of endless possibilities is born. That's where God does God's best work. At that place where everything breaks down. When we discover the limits of what we can do and even believe. When we're lost and we've lost everything that we've grounded ourselves on. When even logic fails, that's when the dead are raised and the empty are filled. Now, one might ask why God doesn't raise the dead or fill the empty when we're feeling good, when life is going well for us, when we're feeling full. Why wait until we're broken down? Why wait until we've lost everything of value to us? And I suspect it's because when we think we've got it all together, when everything's going well, there's not as much room for God in our lives. We're satisfied with what we can do and with our own human abilities and ideas and plans. We're satisfied with the world we've constructed for ourselves. But when it all falls apart, that's when there's space for God. Because when it all falls apart, we are no longer limited by our plans and our abilities and the world that we have created ourselves. We are free then to discover that at the center of who we are is God. And with God, all things are possible. There's a quote from Maya Angelou, and I couldn't find the context of it, so my apologies to her if I'm totally taking it out of context. But it resonates with this idea of becoming empty. She said, "I found that I knew not only that there was a God, but that I was a child of God. When I understood that, when I comprehended that, when I internalized that, ingested that, I became courageous." I became courageous. You see, most of us have a level of anxiety about our world falling apart. I think that's a very human thing. I'd be surprised if someone did not have anxiety about the thought of their world falling apart and losing the things that matter to them. That's why we hang on to them so tightly. But as we are reminded, that's when we find God. And with God, all things are possible. So what if instead of trying to fill the emptiness with things that won't last, what if we embraced it to see what God is doing? Now, I won't lie, that's a scary thought, a scary proposition, because it means recognizing that at my core, I am not my job. I am not my awards. I'm not even my mother's daughter. I'm not even fully my beliefs, which have been shaped by other people for generations before me. I am not my hobbies. I am not the spouse of my wife. I mean, none of these things. What if we stripped all of those things away? What's left? I mean, think about introducing yourself to someone, and you can't talk about what you do for a living or who you're related to or what your hobbies are or anything you've achieved in your life. What will you tell them about yourself? What's left when you strip all that away? Most of us have never done that, at least not intentionally. But what we find when we do that is a God who sees beyond our imperfections, beyond our failures, beyond our fears and our insecurities, and who sees us. All that stuff stripped away, God sees us, a child of God, and God calls us to courageous new beginnings. Years ago, I traveled to Brazil with a friend. We visited an orphanage for children with AIDS in Sao Paulo. It had a profound impact on him. It might not have if he hadn't already been feeling lost and empty in his own life. But like so many of us, even if we're feeling unfulfilled in our work, we're likely to stay there because it's stability. It's a paycheck. In his case, it was also very much his identity. He was a pastor, and as any pastor knows, we have a hard time separating ourselves from our role. But it was crumbling around him. There wasn't any major crisis or anything. It was just ceasing to have meaning for him. It was no longer filling him, and he wasn't sure what to do about it. But then we went to Brazil, and he became courageous. He heard God speak into the vacuum of his soul, and when he got back, he resigned from his church and became the director of a brand new street ministry. And it was the best thing he ever could have done. He was alive then. Elnes says that emptiness becomes a gift when we stop trying to fill it with things that don't last or don't matter or give life. When we stop trying to fill it with those things, then there is space to encounter the fullness of God within our emptiness. I wonder how many nudges from God we miss because we're full. Because we've got it all worked out. We've got our plans. We've got everything under control. How many nudges from God do we miss because we've got it all under control? And I wonder how often we drown out God, because when we do start to hear God's call, it can be pretty scary. Because God pretty much never calls us to places of comfort. Think of Moses. Moses lost everything when he ran away from Egypt, ran out into the wilderness in the middle of nowhere, meets God. And what happens next? God says, I want you to go back to Egypt and talk to Pharaoh. And Moses comes up with this long list of reasons why he can't do that. God never calls us to places of comfort. And that's why it can be scary sometimes. And so when we start to hear God's call, we quickly find other things to fill that empty space so we can drown that voice out. But what if we listen? What if we recognize that all those things we fill our lives in with, no matter how good they are, and many of them are good things, what if we start to recognize that all of that pales in comparison to knowing the living God who loves us? What if we risk setting aside the person we made ourselves to become the person God calls us to be? What if we risk being filled with the God who raised the dead and makes all things possible? Emptiness is a strange gift. You can't really wrap it and just put it under a Christmas tree and open it when you're ready. But it is a holy gift. For we worship a God who emptied God's own self for us, that we might live. That's what this gift is. It's a doorway to life. I hope you open it, and I hope you treasure the possibilities it holds for you. Thanks for joining us at First Presbyterian Church, where faith is nurtured, curiosity encouraged, diversity welcomed, and all are loved. Find out more about us at fpclincoln.org or find us on Facebook.